Hello, it's very good to be with you today. And it's particularly good for me to be speaking from Delhi, which with COVID and all the rest of it, I've not been able to visit for the last 18 months. So it's very good to be back. What I thought I would do is to give you a feel for the global strategic context from a UK perspective, and what that means for our military, and in particular for British Armed Forces. I think what has changed significantly during even my time as the Chief of the Defence Staff over the last 3.5 years in the UK is this realisation that we are very much living now in an era of constant competition. When I was growing up, it was a relatively straightforward bipolar world. That then morphed at the end of the Cold War into what became essentially a unipolar world of Western hegemony led by the US. The eras of benign intervention and then of course 9/11 and everything that has followed in terms of violent extremism and terrorism. And of course, what we now see is a world that's very much a multipolar world, a much more competitive world. And that is having a significant impact on the way we think about it. And of course, it's affecting the United States' strategic posture, which is evolving as well. And of course, for us, the challenge is that we're up against a number of countries that I would describe as being relatively assertive and authoritarian. And these rivals of ours see the global strategic context as a continuous struggle in which all of the instruments of statecraft can be used unconstrained by any distinction between peace and war. And of course, what they're striving to do is to achieve their objectives short of bringing on a hot war. Fait accompli strategies, if you like, that we've seen around the Black Sea and perhaps in other regions as well. Now, all of this is overlaid by violent extremism. And they are perhaps emboldened by what we've seen play out in Afghanistan during August and September. Straight up, I've been involved in Afghanistan myself for the last 20 years, and I have fought against the Taliban alongside the Afghan army that we all sought to create. And it was not the outcome that we hoped for. The only thing that gives me some confidence is that 60% of Afghans have been born since 2001. And they, of course, have grown up in a more modern state. And I'm absolutely certain that they don't want to see Afghanistan go back to the Middle Ages as it was prior to 2001. But I think we need to hold our breath, because I'm absolutely certain that the way in which the country is headed, with a not particularly inclusive government and all of that, means that there is a risk of state fracture and a risk that we'll end up with more extremism. And the emboldenment of extremists more broadly is something that we all need to worry about and focus on. Now, of course, the other interesting question in the global strategic context is the multilateral system. And that's not only being challenged by our assertive authoritarian rivals, who perhaps believe they have a historic right in this system, but it's also, I think, being challenged by the new and evolving global problems that we see that require global solutions, whether that's climate, whether that's pandemics, whether that's biodiversity, population growth, or even the new domains of cyber and space, which are not as well regulated as they might be. All of these are challenges in this very dynamic and complex global strategic context. Now, from a military perspective, this is compounded by a very rapidly evolving character of conflict and perhaps character of politics. And that is being driven by the pervasiveness of information and by the very rapid rate of technological development and change we see at the moment. And I would argue that the pace of change and the size of that change is probably greater than what we saw even in the two world wars of the last century combined. And it's getting quicker every day. Now, what has happened here is that the distinctions that we used to sit back and think about between peace and war, between foreign and domestic policy, between state and non-state, and perhaps even between virtual and reality, are now being blurred. And that blurring has enabled our rivals to develop new tools, tactics, and techniques, which means that they can achieve their objectives in the seams between these blurred distinctions. And that, of course, is about disinformation, as distinct from misinformation. And we've seen a lot of that during the COVID problem. And of course, you see it with cyber, with space, with undersea warfare, with chemical and biological weapons. And of course, the challenge with so much of this is it's very difficult to attribute it. so it can be done in a deniable way. And of course, on top of all of that, we've gone back several hundred years to a new era again of proxies and militias. And we see, for example, the Wagner group, which is an instrument of Russian foreign policy in many ways, being employed in a number of countries in the world and popping up recently in Mali. Now, of course, that is absolutely deniable in terms of foreign and security policy, and that is a challenge for all of us. And then, of course, what's also happened during the last 20 years is that many of our rivals have studied our Western way of war. They've worked out what our weaknesses are, and they've developed new technologies to be able to undermine those weaknesses. And hypersonics is a particularly good example. But we've also seen the use of drones, electronic warfare, and missile systems integrated very effectively, so that nowadays you would be reckless to concentrate your armour on a battlefield because it would become a very significant target. And of course, I mentioned that the character of politics is evolving as well. Increasingly now, we're more likely to see populism and nationalism, and it's becoming increasingly bellicose. And of course, the risk is that not many of our leaders these days have been exposed to the horror of war. And of course, that's dangerous when you think about the risk of escalation and perhaps miscalculation. Compounded perhaps by the fact that some of the Cold War diplomatic mechanisms that we had for controlling arms are beginning to wither on the vine or have disappeared altogether. So to my mind, the greatest threats that we're confronted with at the moment are unwarranted escalation leading to miscalculation. And then the other one I would alert you to, I think, is the insidious undermining of our way of life and our values and our free and open way of living. And of course, what we have to be really careful about is that in seeking to protect that way of life, we mustn't undermine the very freedoms that we're seeking to protect. Now, all of this is the challenge that our government's integrated review of foreign defence security and international development policy sought to answer when it was published in March this year. And whilst it fundamentally recognised that the UK's security is assured through Europe and particularly NATO, it also recognised that the 21st century is going to be the Asian century, and hence it talked about a tilt to the Indo-Pacific. I'll come back to that, but what does all this mean to our military? I think the first observation I would make is that in this very competitive world, it requires us to think in strategic terms about how you effectively play multidimensional checkers. And that requires a different strategic culture, a different posture probably, and a new way of warfare. And we need to think hard about how strategy becomes about setting patterns, strategic predictability, and if you want, operational flexibility. We also feel that we need a new approach to deterrence. The sort of passive deterrence that was very evident during the Cold War now needs to become what we are styling active deterrence. It starts on the basis that we absolutely need to integrate across government and actually across the private sector, if you like, as an enterprise, because it's all of the instruments of national power being brought together that give us the best possible chance of providing that deterrence. What we also need to recognise is in the competitive environment I've described, we need to add a fifth C to our traditional paradigm of comprehension, capability, credibility, and communication when we talk about deterrence. And that is about competition. And competition involves us protecting our critical national infrastructure and our resilience, as we've seen very much during COVID. It involves engagement with allies and with partners, because of course the great advantage we have in respect of our assertive authoritarian rivals is they only really have clients. We have allies and partners and friends. And I suspect the answer is to be building ad hoc communities of interest, a bit like AUKUS, which you'll know was announced a few weeks ago. A lot of this is going to be about soft power, not just about hard power. The other ingredient to it is about constraining, if you like, denial. And that's particularly relevant in the new domains of space and cyber. But it's also about preventing strategic vacuums that can be filled by our rivals. An angle on this that also needs to be thought about and probably requires academic debate is escalation management, because that's now much more complicated in the world that we're living in. It used to be up and down one vertical ladder. Now it is about a spider's web of multiple ladders. And that requires a very different approach to what we might have done 30 or 40 years ago. And fundamentally, all of this is about matching words and deeds. Strategic communications are the new instrument of statecraft, and they are challenging to use in democratic countries. And we need to think hard about how we integrate that into the other instruments of statecraft, which are necessary to achieve active deterrence. Now, of course, the other angle for us in the military is we have to modernize our armed forces, not least to make sure that we have appropriate warfighting capability, because that warfighting capability underpins active deterrence and the competition that I described. And looking forwards, I think it'll evolve like this. It's increasingly going to be a competition between hiding and finding. And we saw that very much in the conflict earlier this year in Azerbaijan, where it was very much about hiding versus finding. We need to move from what I would describe as an industrial age of platforms, increasingly to an information age of systems. We need to recognize that in doing this, large concentrations of force, large platforms, things that are less mobile, they are going to be vulnerabilities, because hiding versus finding implies mobility, small size, redundancies in your systems, and so on and so forth. The way that we've sought to get after this in the UK is to distinguish quite brutally between those capabilities that we would describe as sunset capabilities and those that we would describe as sunrise capabilities. In doing it in this way, it means that we can create the headroom to invest for the future, albeit whilst taking some risk in the short term. We also know that the future of warfare is going to be about speed. It's going to be about speed of decision making, and that can really only work if you've got an effective digital backbone or a combat cloud, rather like your smartphone currently plugs into, that gives you the access to the data and the digital to be able to connect your sensors, your effectors, and your deciders together in one common framework. We also need to recognize that the battle space of the future is going to be contested, and that's going to challenge some of our fundamental assumptions. The sort of missile technology that we're now seeing means that air bases are vulnerable again, as are your ports and your docks, and indeed your barracks. And of course, this battle space is going to be much expanded. We're going to fight much more at reach, and that has question marks about what your ISR capability needs to look like, and indeed the weapon systems you need to fight at reach. But at the heart of all of this, if we're going to get it right, is going to be science and technology. And as India knows only too well, science and technology is now a major determinant of national power. And linking science and technology, research and development, together with experimentation is where we're going to invest a great deal of our effort in the UK. Because whilst we can be reasonably confident that the future will be about information-centric technologies, none of us really have any idea of what the best combination will be of those technologies. And that's why we need to experiment. And of course, it means also that we need to experiment more inclusively with defense companies in the outside world and tech companies as well, because that is where the knowledge and expertise is now found. And if we can do that, clearly we will also think hard about our acquisition system, because the challenge for all of us will be how we acquire capability at the pace of relevance. And that means our acquisition system will need to be overhauled. Now, I did mention the Indo-Pacific tilt, and I wanted to briefly explain what that means from our perspective. It's worth remembering, of course, that the United Kingdom has a long and close military association with the region. 19 out of the 54 member states of the Commonwealth are in the region. We recruit around 250 to 350 soldiers every year from the region and from those Commonwealth countries. And of course, we provide much training and education and exercising with many of those countries. We also recruit 350 Gurkhas per annum from Nepal. And we have many long-standing agreements and relationships. In addition to the Five Powers Defence Agreement, which hits its 50th anniversary this year, there is, of course, the Five Eyes, and there is ASEAN. And the UK is committed, and has been for many years now, to the UN Command in Korea, as well as some 10 UN Security Council resolutions in relation to DPRK. And on top of all of that, we've probably got around 50 formal defence and security-related bilateral agreements. Now, on top of all of that, there's been much made, of course, of the deployment of our carrier strike group with the new carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth The group has made its maiden voyage to the region this year and has been in the Pacific for the last few months. In doing so, despite the challenges of COVID, we've engaged with all of our FPDA partners. We've engaged with 7 out of the 10 ASEAN countries. We've visited Japan, the Republic of Korea, and we've exercised with a number of countries, including the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And HMS Richmond, one of the escorts to the carrier group, has conducted Security Council resolution sanctions around DPRK. The plan now is to engage with India and in the Indian Ocean. And indeed, HMS Queen Elizabeth will be moored off the coast of Mumbai almost as I speak. And we very much hope that that engagement will lead and build on the very close maritime relationship we have with India. Realistically, I suspect this scale of effort will be episodic, but it is our intention to base on a persistent basis 2 smallish warships, HMS Tamar and HMS Spey, who are now in the Pacific, and they are there to strengthen our regional defence cooperation and contribute to what we're trying to achieve in terms of our defence partnerships and relationships with our friends and like-minded countries. And on top of that, it's our expectation that we will send a littoral response group. That's an amphibious force with Marines based upon our future commando force to the region periodically and certainly next year. So in conclusion, all of this is as much about soft power as it is about hard power. I think we're recognising the vibrancy and growth of the region's economy, and we recognise the challenge of the security environment and the many points of tension that exist in the region. It's a strategic approach. It's designed to reinforce our traditional relationships and build new ones so that we can make a positive contribution to security, stability and prosperity in the region. Thank you very much.